Nigeria's headline inflation came in at a sluggish 21.91% for the month of February, up from 21.82% reading in the previous month of January. Joining me now to flesh up the inflation numbers is Abdulqudus. Isiaka is a senior economist at ProShare Nigeria. Thanks for coming in on the show tonight. Thank you so much, sir. Let's start by reading the tea leaves. Read the tea leaves of this latest inflation data for me. What are the big figures in this data, despite very sluggish movement between January and February, and these indicators that you think Nigerians should focus on in the latest inflation report?
Let me start by saying thank you for having me. Headline inflation, as you rightly mentioned, for the month of February, as computed by the National Bureau of Statistics, and it's important to mention that, showed a rise of 11 basis points from 21.82% in January to 21.91% in February on a year-on-year basis. And I don't know about you, but I think that it does interest those of us who had paid attention to the forecast or the projections. We do find it interesting that inflation numbers have again defied expectations. Most forecasts range between 20.9% and 21%, suggesting that we would see some sort of a decline in inflation on a year-on-year basis. Of course, on the back of the severe cash crunch occasioned by the CBN's Naira redesign and demonetization policy. But that didn't quite hold. Food inflation rose, from 24.32% to 24.35%, also defying expectations, given that, we had thought that, perishables would come cheaper in the face of the cash crunch. Or quite on the contrary, core inflation moderated. We saw it moderate from 19.16% to 18.84%. The overall index and the sub-indexes on a month-on-month basis, however, declined, which for us suggests that, this demonetization policy, as well as some of the past, the cumulative impact of some of the past monetary policy actions, namely the 600 basis point rate hikes in 12 months, the 500 basis point raise in CRR, all have had impact on the month-on-month inflation numbers, and not per se on the year-on-year numbers, which is quite interesting. But for the average Nigerian who isn't into all these technicalities, inflation rose to a new high last month, which means, that's a big problem, which of course implies that effective purchasing power for the household has been eroded. Savers or keepers of idle cash, of course, using the rule of 70, would mean that 1,000 naira kept in a piggy bank or in a safe, whatever the safe is, would be worth only 500 naira in less than 3 years. It's also the case that, investors would be confronted with a larger negative real rate of return. If you take the CBN, recently issued CBN issuance, CBN 364-day paper, it does offer 10%. 10% against 21% is, a negative real rate of return. So that all of those taken together, it doesn't quite look like a good number for us.
Okay, so if you look at indications around you talk about the naughty naira and fuel scarcity, as far as those inputs into inflation that we have on hand for the month of February, then we look at where we are right now. Do you think inflation is getting a little bit sticky, or is still moving very strongly ahead of expectations, broadly speaking, in terms of outlook from either the central bank or every other economist as to how quick you would think inflation is advancing in the new year, or is getting a little bit sticky, not really moving as fast as everyone would expect?
Well, I think if you consider the core component or the core sub-index, and you observe the fact that it did moderate, as I mentioned before now, from 19.18% to 18.84%. Yes. Also, if you consider the fact that month-on-month inflation also declined to about 1.71%, you may tend to feel that, inflation would at some point, begin to decline. Of course, however, we do not think that it would decline up to the target, within the target range of the CBN. The CBN has a single-digit target, less than 10% target for inflation. We don't think that can be achieved without addressing some of the core fundamental issues, and that takes us to the issues of diagnostics. So in understanding the makeup of the inflationary worries of Nigeria, you need to take into consideration the fact that the exchange rate in 1 year, within a 12-month period, we saw it decline by 24%. Of course, in the parallel market, in the official window, it didn't quite decline by that much. But it did decline at any rate. Also, the cost of energy, particularly diesel prices, also declined or rose, right, by 180% in the 12-month period, also contributing to inflation. I think another factor that mustn't be overlooked are the supply bottlenecks. So the number of levies non-state actors charge or levy on haulage trucks around the country, of course, feeds it into the cost of commodities and even services at the end of the day. So I think those, as well as even the dwell time at the ports, all of these supply bottlenecks would need to be addressed if at all we will see inflation moderate, as we would love to have it moderate to single digits range.
Was that an expectation, Abdulqudus? Was there an expectation that inflation for the month of January or February will go very strongly higher based on the very strong and tough experience Nigerians have in terms of the scarcity of the naira and the inability to purchase basic food items, as it were? Will it be impactful on inflation, or do you think it's going to be on the GDP, where we're likely going to see this very major situation in Nigeria's monetary environment that I haven't seen in my lifetime?
Okay, so in the period, we saw a contraction of 1.78 trillion naira. Between December and January, we saw a contraction of 1.78 trillion naira in the amount or in the currency outside of bank votes, leaving just a little above 780 billion naira outside of bank votes. That definitely has an impact on economic activities, and we did see that reflect on PMI figures. We saw business activity decline the way it has never in the history of the series, crashing to 44.7 index points in the month of February. And so I would say that basically and typically would have an impact on the size and volume of economic activities. And of course, judging by basic macroeconomic theory, you would expect that if money supply contracts, prices also, if effective demand also follows that pattern, prices also should decline. And that's why I did say at the beginning of my remarks that we were, I wouldn't say pleasantly surprised, we were quite surprised by the turnout of the numbers. So we did expect a little bit of a moderation on the back of, if you like, some of the pains that we have endured in the last 3 months.
Oh, interesting. So if you put all of this together for me into the latest inflation reading impact, how do you think the central bank rate decision meeting Monday and Tuesday will go?
Yeah, so the Monetary Policy Committee is due to meet next week. And our expectation is that, judging by the voting pattern in the last meeting, which was strongly hawkish, we had a unanimous decision. If we also consider the fact that between the last meeting and this meeting that's going to be coming up next week, we've seen GDP figures coming quite strongly, 3.52% for Q4. It's also going to be, some reasons to expect that the Monetary Policy Committee would raise rates. We also think that the rising inflation, which of course has hit a new high, would also be a reason for them to want to continue. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution lies in raising rates. We've seen 600 basis points rate hike. We've seen 500 basis points increase in cash reserve requirement. We've seen even a demonetization policy that almost wrecked the economy. And yet the only impacts have been on the month-on-month numbers, not quite on the year-on-year numbers. So I think that we need to address some of the fundamental issues. Maybe they are beyond the monetary policy scope or paradigm. But of course, as it affects the monetary policy authority, we need to talk about the foreign exchange regime. I think it's perhaps time that we begin to talk about a review of the managed float exchange rate regime. Perhaps we should be adopting something much more reflective of our situation currently, and then we devalue our currency in line with our inflation rate. And of course, we would endure pains initially, but in the long run, we should attract much more flows in FX. And stability, and also closing the parallel premium, which should ensure that in the long run we attract much more FX flows, and then we begin to pick up from there. But it must be said that 70% of our inflation worries are associated with our exchange rate challenges. So if that is dealt with, then I think we can begin to talk about a single-digit inflation target.
Oh, great. We appreciate your time and perspectives on Nigeria's latest inflation report. Thank you so much for bringing the macros into it and what happens next. Thank you so much. Have a pleasant evening and see you next time. Abdulqudus Isiaka, Senior Economist at ProShare Nigeria.